Watch this video, take notes, and answer these questions to the best of your ability. What is the role of angels in the Quran? What are the jinn? Who is Iblis? What is typology? What is a mathal? Who are some of the former prophets that the Quran discusses? And how do they function as types? Define Hanif and Ummah. How does the Quran discuss Muhammad? Last time, we spoke a bit about the layout of the Quran, its oral origins, and how it passed into text. We discussed its major themes, like the oneness of God and how this God speaks to the world through signs, ayat, found in nature, people, and texts, and how people are to react to these signs of God. Are they believers, those who have iman, faith in God? Are they people of the book, Jews and Christians who received prophecies before? Are they associators who commit shirk, who associate the signs of God with God itself? Continuing from that discussion, now we're going to look at some of the specifics of the Quran's vision of the world and how it presents its arguments. While the Quran sometimes just commands its listeners to do this or don't do that, it usually isn't so legally minded. Instead, the Quran, more often than not, presents what it's saying using various literary techniques to give it a lot more rhetorical force than just a mere list of commands would. That is, the Quran uses drama, imagery, and poetic turns of phrase. Consider this verse. Know that this present life is nothing but jest and diversion, and a passing splendor, and a cause for boasting among you, and a rivalry in wealth and children. Like rain, the vegetation it produces pleases the disbelievers. Then it withers, and you see it turning yellow. Then it becomes broken debris. In the hereafter, there is a harsh punishment. So what's this ayah saying? The life that we have in this world doesn't last. People are proud of their possessions and their children. But those things don't last forever. Like rain creates plants that will eventually die and rot away, worldly gain and familial happiness will all fade eventually. Everything material will be lost. Every person will die. And if you get too invested in these temporary things, you will be punished in the afterlife, in the fire of hell. But the Quran doesn't just spit that all out. You have to work for it a little bit. The Quran is much more like poetry than prose. It uses symbols, similes, indirect speech, and it paints pictures with words. Because the Quran demands a bit of you, the point it tries to make packs a bit more of a wallop than if it just said straight out that everything is temporary. Remember that the primary audience of the Quran, the people who received it first, were living in the Hijaz in the early 7th century. They speak Arabic, which at that time was a mostly oral language. Most of the people who are listening to the Quran probably can't read and write, and even if they could, even fewer would have access to books. So, in other words, the Quran has to stick because it's a performance. It's not a book that you can read or reread at your leisure. You have to remember what it's saying. So, poetic language is particularly good at activating your memory. Think how much easier it is to memorize a song with a good rhyme than it is to memorize straight prose like you'd see in a textbook. Things you have to think about for a moment are much more likely to stay in your memory than things that are obvious. And drama is much more powerful than just a list of information. And so drama makes you recall things more easily. The Quran does all this. It uses beautiful, complicated speech that has rhythm and rhyme. It uses drama and demands that you pay attention in order to understand. We shall make you recite, and you will not forget, except whatever God pleases. Surely he knows what is spoken publicly and what is hidden. We shall make it very easy for you. In a very oral culture, people do try to memorize things much more often than they do in a very literate culture like our own. And sure enough, people did try to memorize the Quran. But most of the time, most people aren't really trying to memorize things verbatim. Instead, people would just remember what they remember, whether they liked what they heard, whether it was beautiful, and what it was about. So, much of the Quran would have been remembered by its first audience for its themes, rather than for its every single word. In that case, people then, like today, will be more likely to remember stories, narratives. It may be easy to remember a song or a well-rhymed bit of verse, but it's really, really easy to remember a story. You may forget words, even to a song that you've heard many times, but you will probably remember what a movie is about without even trying. Plot points and narratives stick. So for most people in the Quran's first audience, like most people throughout Islamic history, if you ask them, what is the Quran about? They'll probably recall the narratives of the Quran, the people, supernatural beings, and legends that the Quran talks about. It's stories. And again, the Quran is speaking first to people living in Arabia in late antiquity. And like we've discussed before, that means that the Quran assumes that they know things that people in that culture would know. So, for example, on many occasions, the Quran discusses Jesus. Well, Christianity had already been a very common religion in late antiquity, even in Arabia. So people already had some idea of who Jesus was, even if they weren't Christians themselves. So that means the Quran cuts to the chase. Rather than reintroducing a familiar figure like Jesus, who the audience would have heard of their entire lives, the Quran just assumes that you know who this person Jesus is, and will tell you a story about him without giving you all the background. Now, on the positive side, that means that the Quran can just get to the point. Here's what you need to know about this person named Jesus. And in an oral culture, where you have to remember everything, it certainly helps to keep extraneous details to a minimum. But, on the negative side, if you're not living in the culture of 7th century Arabia, which we aren't, we have to fill in some blanks. The Quran speaks as if we have particular knowledge that anyone in its original environment would already know. But since we're not in that original environment ourselves, we have to reconstruct the stories of the Quran a little bit. More on that point. The Quran rarely tells a story from beginning to end. Keeping with the example of Jesus, the Quran never gives us his whole biography. Why would it? Late antique people in Arabia already knew all that stuff. So instead, the Quran focuses in on particular events, conversations, and episodes from the life of Jesus when it's useful to making a certain point. And it does this with almost everyone. Only a very few number of times does the Quran give us a long, detailed narrative of just one story in chronological order. Instead, it almost always just jumps right into the middle of a story just to make the point it needs to make, and then just as quickly jumps on to the next story. So, if you look at the Quran for the stories it tells, you might get a little confused, because it thinks in bursts of imagery, and not so often in long plots that go on for many pages. The Quran tells us a variety of stories regarding the vast creation that God has made. There are stories of people, of course, but there are also stories of animals and of the earth, and as well as some supernatural beings. Each species has a role to play in this world and in the worlds to come. On top of all this, of course, is the one God of the Quran, who freely and often interacts with created beings. 3 species of created beings in particular are of note here. First, there are the angels, the Malaika. These are God's functionaries in creation. They do various tasks that are assigned to them. They control natural forces, like the clouds and the thunder. They record the deeds of people in preparation for the resurrection from the dead and final judgment. They guard the pits of hellfire. They carry God's throne through the heavens. They fight in battles alongside humans. Some of the angels have names. There are familiar angels from Jewish and Christian stories, who the first audience would already know about. Angels like Michael, Mikael, and Gabriel, Jibril. But on the whole, the Quran doesn't dwell too much on the angels themselves, even though it mentions them constantly. For example, Gabriel, who in the future will become the most important angel in Islamic storytelling and literature, is only referenced 3 times in the Quran by name, and never does the Quran give us any kind of backstory for him. The Quran just mentions in passing that Gabriel exists, and the audience is expected to know what this name Gabriel means. There might be good reason for the Quran working this way. Remember that the Quran's major theme is God's oneness and uniqueness, that there are no other gods, that this one God alone is worthy of worship. Well, in late antiquity, there were people who treated angels like gods. There are well-known examples of some Jews and some Christians praying to various angels, and most commonly invoking angels in a form of magic. Naturally, the God of the Quran wants none of this. This is shirk, associating a created being with the Creator itself. It's idolatry. So, the Quran is clear that angels exist, and they are significant, but it rarely puts a spotlight on them either. Know that they're real, but don't get too distracted by them. And in the exception that proves the rule, the longest narrative in the Quran about any angels is a warning against just that. The Quran says that 2 angels, named Harut and Marut, once came to ancient Babylon and taught people there magic. But this was only on God's orders as a kind of test. Before teaching people their sorcery, Harut and Marut would always say, "Our situation is a temptation for humans, so do not conceal the truth." That is, yes, there are angels, and yes, they have powers, but they remain the servants of God. They are ayat, signs. They point to God. They don't point to themselves. The angels are not the only supernatural species in the Quran's world either. Living alongside humans are the jinn, powerful spirits that change form and tend to have animal-like characteristics. The jinn, the Quran tells us, are beings that God made from a smokeless fire. Sometimes they're good. On at least one occasion, some of the jinn are even referred to as Muslims. These are the jinn who submit to the one God. And some other times, the jinn are troublesome or even evil. That is, like people, jinn appear to have some ability to choose between right and wrong. The most famous of the jinn is Iblis, that is, Satan, the devil. The Arabic name Iblis is from the Greek diabolos, the one cast out. It's the same root as the Spanish word diablos, or the English diabolical. While in Christian legend the devil, Satan, is an angel who disobeyed God, in the Quran Iblis is not an angel, but one of the jinn. And don't think of Iblis as some kind of anti-god either. Iblis, the Satan of the Quran, is no threat to God. He's just one more created being like others. Where Iblis is different, though, is that he has the unique role of testing the human race, trying to get them to worship false gods in material things in place of God. So, while Iblis is powerful, he remains just a created being who is subservient to God's authority. And then we have human beings, who the Quran tells us are made from clay or mud. That is, we're corporeal beings. We have solid bodies, unlike the shape-shifting jinn who are made of fire, or the transcendent angels. And of course, our powers are considerably more limited than the jinn and the angels. But, at the same time, the Quran is clear that the human race is somehow special. Indeed, the Quran says specifically that the earth itself was made for humanity. Also, like the jinn, humans are offered some degree of autonomy to choose good or evil for themselves. That is, humans are special because they're free. But that also means they require assistance to do the right thing. They require signs from God to point them in the right direction. We noted last time that the Quran refers to more than 20 different people as prophets, and hints that there are many, many more besides those who are named in the Quran directly. So, who are these prophets, these nabis, who have been charged by God to guide people to proper actions and belief? The bulk of the prophets mentioned in the Quran are familiar characters from Jewish and Christian lore. And I mean lore, not books. Remember that the world of late antique Arabia wasn't home to many books. And, in fact, we have no evidence of any book being written in the Arabic language, or even translated into it, before the appearance of the Quran in the 7th century. So, when the Quran talks about famous prophets, who also happen to appear in the anthology of literatures that we in English call the Bible, what the Quran is talking about are stories that people would have spoken orally to one another, and probably not stories that they would have read somewhere. We sent our messengers in succession, and we turned them into stories. While some of the stories of the prophets in the Quran roughly parallel the written stories of the prophets found in other books, including the books of the Bible, that doesn't mean the Quran is referring to the Bible or to any other text. Instead, think of a vast landscape of spoken stories told around campfires and in sermons across the Middle East for many centuries. Every so often, one of these stories would get written down by someone, but usually they weren't. And so when we today see a story in some book of the Bible, for instance, and then see a similar story in the Quran, all that means is that many thousands of people were circulating that story for centuries. And these are just two examples of those stories that found their way to paper. It doesn't mean the Quran is citing other texts. So back to the prophets. Most of the prophets that appear in the Quran would have been well known to late antique people. The Quran tells stories of the first human being, Adam, who God made from clay and granted him special knowledge of the created world. And then there is Noah, who was spared by God from a massive flood that killed nearly everyone on earth. Abraham, an ancient monotheist and the forefather of the people of Israel, who, like in the Christian New Testament, is called God's friend. Yusuf, Joseph, Abraham's great-grandson, who was gifted by God with prophetic dreams, and later became a powerful minister in the royal court of Egypt. And then, centuries later, Musa, Moses, was sent to lead the descendants of Abraham and Joseph back out of Egypt to a special land blessed by God. And centuries after that, Isa, Jesus, whom the Quran uniquely calls El-Messiah, the Messiah, continued preaching to the people of Israel about the oneness of God and worked miracles and signs on God's behalf. Remember what we said earlier, though. For the most part, the Quran doesn't give us full recaps of each of these prophets' biographies. The audience already knows that much. Instead, the Quran mentions the various prophets and messengers in order to make certain points. The Quran often says that it's speaking in mathals, comparisons, parables. This thing is like this other thing, if you think about it. A mathal, which can be a metaphor, a simile, or an allegory, is the Quran's way of telling us how two otherwise unrelated stories or people are, in fact, directly connected to each other, even if the stories take place thousands of years apart. This is referred to by scholars today as typology. Typology is a kind of literary device common to the Quran and to many other late antique literatures. Typology is the use of analogies from one story to another in order to make an argument. It works like this. You tell a story that foreshadows something else. The story that's doing the foreshadowing is called a type. The type, story, or figure reminds the listener or reader of another story or situation, which is called the antitype. By understanding something or someone in the past, the audience learns something about their present, or sometimes their future. Regarding the prophets, the types of the Quran, that is, the ancient prophets, refer to the Quranic audience's present situation, which is the antitype. These old tales of the past tell the audience something about here and now, and most specifically, about this new prophet who's standing in front of them, a man named Muhammad. Oddly, the Quran rarely mentions Muhammad by name. While it talks to him a lot, you can tell because in Arabic there's a masculine singular you, so you know sometimes it's addressing just a single man and other times a group of people. The Quran only 4 times, though, actually uses the name Muhammad. Furthermore, if you were to try and reconstruct the life of Muhammad, as found in the Quran, you would find very little to work with other than some passing details. However, in another way, the Quran talks about Muhammad endlessly in the form of types. Past prophets who remind the audience what is happening in their present. The past prophets tell you something about this new prophet. Here are some examples. Both Jews and Christians claim descent from the prophet Abraham. But Abraham himself was not a Jew or a Christian. He couldn't be, since he lived before Moses brought the Torah, and hence Abraham couldn't practice Judaism. And he lived long before Jesus, and so he couldn't practice Christianity. Abraham was a Gentile, a non-Jew, a non-Christian. The Quran calls him a Hanif, a righteous person who worships the one God, but isn't a Jew or Christian. And yet, both Jews and Christians revere Abraham as a man of faith who is loved by God. So in other words, both Jews and Christians already acknowledge that there are moral, upright people who aren't members of their own communities, and yet are still blessed by God with the role of being prophets. Now, imagine that you are in the Quran's present in late antique Arabia. There's a man standing before you named Muhammad, and he claims to be a prophet sent by God. You could also imagine Jews or Christians arguing that their communities alone are favored by God, and so they don't have to listen to outsiders. Why would a God send a prophet to them anyway? That is, Muhammad is not a Jew or a Christian, so why should Jews or Christians believe that God is speaking to him? Well, the Quran uses Abraham as Muhammad's type. Once upon a time, God had a virtuous servant and prophet named Abraham, who was neither a Jew nor a Christian. And Jews and Christians already believe that. So, the argument that God doesn't speak to people who aren't Jews or Christians, say people like Muhammad, doesn't work. And Jews and Christians already agree that the argument doesn't work. Because they believe in Abraham's prophecy, they can't just discount Muhammad's prophecy. The type of the Gentile Hanif prophet, Abraham, foreshadows the antitype of Muhammad, who is also a Gentile Hanif prophet. How about another one? Centuries before the time of Muhammad, the prophet Moses was sent to the people of Israel while they were in captivity in Egypt. Moses' role as a prophet included guiding an oppressed group of people to their freedom, as well as guiding them religiously. There is already an ancient precedent for both Jews and Christians for prophets to be the rallying point of certain communities, with Moses as the type. And again, the antitype is Muhammad, who in the Quran's present in late antique Arabia is going to do something similar. Muhammad was also attempting to build a community and ummah of believers. That is, a group of people from many different tribal groups. These people would later be called the first Muslims. Like Moses long ago had gathered a community around himself as part of his prophetic mission, so too does this new prophet have his own people, his own ummah, his own community of faith. Moses is the type, Muhammad the antitype. Nearly all of the Quran's prophets can be understood like this, as types. They point into the present, the life of Muhammad, who is speaking the Quran. And therefore, the old prophets act as comparisons and forerunners. By following Muhammad, you affirm the validity of these former prophets. And if you want to follow the former prophets, like Moses, Abraham, and Jesus, you have to affirm the prophethood of Muhammad. The past informs the present, and the present informs the past. That's typology. Interestingly, though, the Quran sticks to this use of types and antitypes throughout. So rarely does the Quran ever say that Muhammad is in any way different than the prophets in the past. In fact, the Quran seems to be much more interested in saying that all the prophets are equal to each other. The messengers and the believers have faith in what is revealed to them from their Lord. Every one of them believed in God, his angels, his scriptures, and his messengers, saying, "We find no differences between the messengers of God." They have also said, "We heard God's commands and obeyed them. Lord, we need your forgiveness, and to you we shall return." In the generations following the days of Muhammad, this ummah, this group of people soon to be called Muslims, started to wonder if and how they were in fact distinct from Jews and Christians. And most especially, how is their prophet, Muhammad, unique, special, and in a way set apart from the prophets and messengers who came before him? Sure, the Quran says that Muhammad is like the former prophets, but now the question arises, is he something better than them? Think about these questions for class. What is the role of angels in the Quran? What are the jinn? Who is Iblis? What is typology? What is a mathal? Who are some of the former prophets the Quran discusses, and how do they function as types? Define Hanif and Ummah. How does the Quran discuss Muhammad?